Following on from Kim's presentation, I'd like to present the case of one of my clients that I am calling Murad. I've changed Murad's personal details to protect his confidentiality, and I do have his permission to present this case. Murad is a 58-year-old Feyli Kurdish man born in Iraq and raised in Iran, who has been STAR's client since 2016. He speaks Arabic and Farsi, but the sessions are held in Farsi. Murad came to Australia in June of 2013 by boat, and he has no family in Australia. He came on his own to Australia, and he left behind his wife and son and daughter. Soon after he arrived in Australia, his wife filed for divorce and divorced him soon after. His son currently lives in Austria, and his daughter remains in Iran. Murad's religion is Shia, and his religion constitutes a major protective factor and coping resource. He's currently unemployed and receives special benefit from Centrelink due to many health issues, physical and psychological. He has completed his Year 10 education and presents as an intelligent and reflective man. He has engaged very well with therapy, and he has attended 54 sessions to date, and he attends face-to-face counseling sessions due to his hearing impairment. In this presentation, Murad presents with clinical presentations characterized by a survivor of transgenerational trauma following the psychological and physical torture, as well as systemic and systematic persecution, discrimination, forced displacement, and being rejected by host culture and own culture. In order for you to understand Murad's story, I will provide some context to Kurdish Feyli people to understand the case better. I will also present with the trauma history, assessment, my interventions, and the outcomes. Kurdistan is not a country, but this is a map of where the Kurdish people have historically established a prominent population and unified cultural identity, which is these dots that you can see that are in yellow. The Kurds are an ethnic group numbering around 30 million people in the world and are recognized as the largest stateless national group in the world. Throughout the history of this area, the Kurds have fought against the Turks, Arabs, and Persians in trying to establish an autonomous or independent state, but have always been defeated. And in defeat, they've pressed from some degree of autonomy, which was granted, but inevitably revoked. Cyclically, the Kurds reorganized, rearmed, and revolted, and were again forcibly put down. The Kurds in northern Iraq have successfully established their own autonomy, and it's called the Kurdistan Regional Government. Who are Feyli Kurds? Feyli Kurds are an ethnic minority within a minority group. As majority of Kurds are Sunni, the Feyli Kurds are Shia. They are not accepted within their own community nor their host country. Feylis in Iran live predominantly in Ilan province, as you can see from this map, and parts of Lorestan, and have from the beginning of the 19th century moved westwards. Feyli Kurds speak a distinct dialect of Kurdish and adhere to the Shafi school. Feyli Kurds are about 1 to 2 million out of the 30 million Kurds. During the Ottoman period, the Feyli Kurds living in Iraq had the choice of registering as Ottoman or Persian. Many chose to align themselves with Iran and to avoid military service, and to align themselves with the tribal and familial ties with the Feylis living in Iran. They were hence classified as one of Ottoman or Persian descent. The deportation of the Feyli Kurds to Iran began in 1936 during the government of Taha Yassin al-Hashemi. This process continued in the Iran-Iraq War. This alleged connection to Iran and the perceived disloyalty to Iraq was used to justify their denationalization in 1980 under the Decree 666. This denationalization rendered approximately 300,000 of the Feyli Kurds stateless, and it occurred amidst persecution, torture, arbitrary executions, and forced deportation to Iran. Feylis who went to Iran and could present proof of Iranian ancestry were able to apply and obtain Iranian citizenship, while the majority were not granted identity documents and have been unable to have access to education, healthcare, employment, and have experienced harassment and discrimination by the government. When Murad's father was young, his family lived in Western Iran. However, they were expelled and told to go to Iraq because they were simply Feyli Kurds and they belonged to Iraq. Murad's father and grandfather were both numerously targeted, arrested, persecuted by the Iraqi government with no obvious cause but other than being Feyli Kurds, and told to return to Iran. Murad was born in Iraq, but he was 6 years of age when his parents packed up everything and left Iraq without any belongings and lived a very, very difficult life in Iran because they had no money and they could not speak the language. He always tells me that his parents were always marginalized for being dirty Arabs. Murad recalls that his parents picked names when they were in Iran and both in Iraq that would not identify as being Shia or Sunni because of their safety. Murad talks about his cousin disappearing in Iraq, assumed to be captured by the Iraqi government and never to be seen again. In addition to all this trauma experienced, he often recalls his prolonged traumatic boat journey where he got lost 3 times in the sea during their journey. In addition to that, he speaks of being detained and staying in detention centers in Christmas Island for 6 months. Stressful experiences of his refugee application process, re-traumatization, being discriminated and treated as a second-class citizen, both within Australian government system and in his own community. This is the genogram for Murad. As I explained, his wife left him almost 10 years ago, 9 years ago. His son had to escape Iran as his life was in danger, and he's now a refugee in Austria. His daughter separated in Iran as he was in a domestic violence relationship and was married to a man who was working for the government's intelligence and unable to have a fair hearing in court. And she's now left him and is living in hiding somewhere in Iran. The clinical symptoms of Murad are consistent with the academic literature on transgenerational trauma, as you can see in this slide. He presents with symptoms of what Sargsyan and Sharkey call perceived and persistent fear. Sargsyan and Sharkey, in their literature review on intergenerational trauma and mental health needs among Armenian genocide descendants, talk about this presentation. This perceived and persistent fear is when Murad presents with the fear of everything and everyone. Murad presents with a sense of worthlessness, and van der Kolk argues with the intra and intergenerational transference of negative attitudes and with the transmission of historical trauma across family, a child's sense of safety and trust in the world is impacted and consequently reduces their sense of worth. It establishes or increases their level of emotional distress, shame, and grief. Murad presents with distressing emotions of anger, shame, and guilt. And Atkinson et al., in their chapter on addressing individual and community transgenerational trauma in the Aboriginal Australians, mention lack of trust in others and extreme isolation. Mind calls it collective emotional and psychological injury. This refers to the historical trauma Murad and his community have experienced, which has passed cyclically from generation to generation. He often talks about his children calling him selfish because he only thought about himself. When he escaped Iran, he came here and he's not able to go and visit them or able to bring them because of his visa conditions. Zubrik et al., who conducted research on the impact of intergenerational trauma on the Aboriginal children in Australia, argued that the transmission of trauma can impact and cause the breakdown of family and attachment between children and their caregivers. Having no permanent visa attributes to his trauma of homelessness and no sense of belonging. He always recalls that he does not know what it's like to belong to a country and a community because everywhere he goes, he's rejected and not wanted. When I saw Murad the first time in our first session, Murad presented much older than his specified age. He was neatly dressed with no eye contact. He was sitting on the edge of the seat and he was carrying his backpack on his lap with a very soft voice, representing a whole life of being silenced. At the time of assessment, Murad completed the following assessment, and the Hopkins Symptoms Checklist and the Harvard Trauma Questionnaire, both of which have been validated with refugee populations, was utilized. Murad was provided with a Farsi version of the questionnaire, and it is believed that his responses are an accurate representation of his self-report. And the scores indicated symptomatic for anxiety, depression, and PTSD. As stated by Arosh and Coelho, refugee experiences are a complex interaction between torture, trauma, exile, migration, and the resettlement process. It takes place in a normal life cycle, affected by national and international events. For example, in Murad's case, he has been separated from his family. He's currently unemployed. The impact of COVID that he experienced, both in Australia and in Iran, the current unrest in Iran, and the asylum seeker experience that he's still going through, which has discriminated him against and not be eligible to receive services due to his visa conditions. The treatment goals that both Murad and I were able to negotiate with have been pointed, as you can see here. He believes that when he's granted a permanent visa, all his problems will be solved and he will be better, establishing a sense of safety and some control over his life. The validation of the injustice perpetrated on the Feyli community, not just on him, but the Feyli community in the world, and the reprocessing of the trauma to shift the negative beliefs around the feelings of anger, guilt, and shame. In addressing Murad's trauma, I was guided by the ADAPT model developed by Professor Silov, who constitutes of 5 pillars. I'm going to go through the 5 pillars and my work with Murad quite quickly because I'm aware of the time. Safety and security are fundamental and pivotal to mental health recovery. And the post-traumatic stress reaction is a normal survival response to threat, which can become dysregulated, as you can see here. I have developed a good therapeutic relationship with Murad by providing safety and a non-judgmental attitude. I have provided case management and practical assistance with empathy without prejudice, such as food vouchers, credit vouchers, referral to various services, report writing, and other support. I have provided psychoeducation, stress management techniques to provide emotional regulation skills. And I have tried to build his survival capacity in a non-pathological framework. Psychoeducation to increase insight into the function of anger and the high value of scientific inquiry, reasoning, and logic in Islam supported openness to this process. The second point has been bonds and networks. And I have provided and assisted him to develop trust and make new friends and connections, and not think everyone is there to harm him. Focusing on grief has been very important. And in our sessions, Murad has had a comfortable space to grieve, which in turn has supported him in connection with his children. However, unfortunately he has been marginalized, not just by the Australian community, but by the Kurdish community in Australia, because he's Shia. Justice. Justice is something that Murad talks about almost every session. And he says that I have not been able to find justice anywhere in the world. Validating and acknowledging experience and being a witness to his story, and validating his anger as a normative emotional response to injustice, a reaction that in many instances is justified and adaptive, and gently redirecting it to something more productive. Murad needed to develop his sense of identity as a Feyli Kurd. And this is something that we go through under the 4th pillar, which is roles and identities. And as a father, find a sense of belonging and inclusion despite his current visa circumstances, such as referral to English classes, teaching leadership skills to support other asylum seekers, which he often does. So if he meets other people that are asylum seekers, he often refers them to STARS to get more help. And establishing meaningful roles and sense of mastery over life. And the last point, which is existential meaning, which Murad is a devoted Muslim, and his faith was a source of strength, and he found meaning to experiences through his faith. And he was linked to a local Shia mosque and other rituals such as Ramadan. Despite the challenges relating to his visa and the stringent conditions relating to his visa, Murad could have achieved so much more if his life conditions were stable. However, I'm pleased to let you know that throughout the 54 sessions, there have been some achievements, some outcomes that have been achieved, which I can share with you. Murad presents with some increased sense of self-confidence, his rights to speak and to ask for help, and not accept to be mistreated simply because he's a Feyli Kurd. I have supported him to have some sense of control of his life, and he does feel that he has some control in some areas of his life. Increased resilience. Despite all the difficulties he has experienced and his generations, previous generations have experienced, he remains highly resilient. Increased confidence to reach out for help. So if he often gets stuck or he needs help or he needs some guidance, he often contacts me in between sessions. So I'm very happy that he feels confident enough to do so. And increased confidence to make new friends and connections and not think that everyone is there to harm him. Some changes in his distorted thoughts through psychoeducation, that he's not crazy and that his problems are not his fault. We are anxiously waiting for his permanent visa following the announcement by the federal government last year. And we are hoping that following some advocacy and some report writing that are provided to RAGS and the immigration, he'll be granted he'll be granted a permanent visa, and he'll be able to go and visit his son, his daughter, and hopefully sponsor his daughter to come to Australia. Thank you for your time, and thank you for listening. And I'm going to go to the next slides, which are some references for my presentation. Thank you again.